Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with another episode of Storycraft. Took a little hiatus, a little breaky poo before I got back here, and I am back, and I am ready to tell you guys another story. And today I have a doozy for you. It is The Fairy of the Three-Branched Oak, or something along those lines. The proper title will be in the title. It has a lot of different names, and I think I'm smushing a couple together, so yeah, here we are. If you guys are just joining me, Storycraft is where I tell you guys a story, and I do a craft, and it's actually a limited series, so once I hit 100 episodes of Storycraft, I will be stopping it in this format on the channel, and I will update you guys about what happens after that, so just stay tuned. At any rate, the Three-Branched Oak Tree Fairy story of really long-winded title that we're getting into right now starts off in the way long ago, as the best stories do. And starts with the king, who has a great kingdom, a fantastic kingdom even, and he's having a good time, except that he's bored. You know, he has everything he could ever ask for, except a wife. And he doesn't really like anybody in his kingdom. He's like, nah, everybody bores me here. So he's just discontent. And one day he decides he's going to go hunting, you know, to see if he can bring some spark, some zest back to his life. And so he heads off into the woods on his own to go hunting. And he happens to see a rabbit. So he notches his bow, he gets ready to fire, and the rabbit's like, whoa, my good sir. If you would spare my life, I would do you a favor in return, I promise it. And the king's like, nah, I got nothing to lose. So he lets the rabbit go. And, you know, he continues to walk in the woods, and after a while, he sees a fox, and he's like, all right, I'm gonna take this guy down. So notches another arrow, gets ready to fire, and the fox is like, whoa, guy, hold up. If you don't kill me, if you spare my life, I will owe you a favor. In fact, I'll do you the best favor anyone could possibly do. And the king's like, well, can't really pass up on that deal. How many times do you get an offer for, like, a favor from a fox? So he's like, all right, you're free to go. So the fox goes off on his way. And then he sees a deer, and he's like, all right, this is it. This is going to be the one. So he gets ready to fire his bow, and then the deer's like, whoa, please. Oh my God, please. You see, I'm just a gentle deer folk, and if you were to spare my life, I would do you a favor. In fact, I would do you a favor right now if you spared my life. And the king's like, well, that's actually a better offer than I got from the last two animals who offered me a deal and then just fucked off into the woods. Yeah, I'll take you up on that offer. What's the deal? And so the deer's like, okay, hear me out. If you continue down this path, you'll find a oak tree that is larger than any oak tree in this forest has any right to be. And when you get there, there's going to be 3 branches. It only has 3 branches. It's massive, 3 branches. If you cut one of the branches, a fairy will come out. If you offer her water, you can take her to wife. And he's like, a fairy wife? Really? Okay, yeah, that's a fantastic deal. So he goes down the path until he finds the oak tree, and he sees it has 3 branches, and he's like, wow, this is a big tree. I'm gonna cut the branches off. Using his little tiny axe, he cuts the little branches off, 1 branch at a time. 1 branch falls, right? And then a fairy comes out. She just magically appears. That's the sound. And when she comes out, she's like, oh my gosh, water, please, I need water. And he's like, oh yeah, totally, I forgot almost for a second. So he goes to get his little flask of water, his little canteen of water, fumbles it, spills it all over the ground, and wouldn't you know it, guys, the fairy dies. She passes away. She dies of thirst. Which is why you should drink more water. Stay hydrated. So you don't end up like this fairy. So, despondent, the king's like, aw, man. So he goes back home. He takes her body with him, because, of course, he does. Why would he leave it there? That's so weird. This strange fairy he's never met, who just came out of an oak tree. And then he buries it. And he spends a couple weeks mourning this loss because it's entirely his fault. It's entirely his fault she died. He fumbled the water. So, yeah, when he gets over it, when he moves on after a couple of weeks, he decides to go back out into the woods, and there he happens across the fox. He's like, hey, heard what happened last time. Let me do you another favor. You can actually go back to that oak tree, cut another branch, give her some water, and take another fairy bride with you. And he's like, there's another fairy in there? Okay, great. Yeah, fantastic. And as he's walking along to the oak tree, he never considers that this isn't actually a favor. It's just the fox reminding him that he had 3 chances and he missed the first one. But the fox did his job, right? So the king gets to the tree, he chops another branch, and this time, you guys, he doesn't have water in his little canteen. He has wine, which he's like, same difference, right? So the fairy comes out and she's like, whoa, my gosh, I was in there for so long, I just need some water. Please let me have some water. And if you've ever been offered wine instead of water when you want water, you'll know how this fairy feels, because she takes a sip of the wine from the canteen and she immediately dies. Because it's not water and it's not hydrating. All she wanted was some water. And the king's like, aw, man, another one, I fucked up. I just murdered another woman. Aw, shit. So he takes her body bag, buries it next to the first fairy, and he's like, I gotta think about how I'm such an asshole in these woods every time I go out there. So he sits in his castle for a few more weeks, and then decides, okay, why not? I'm gonna go hunting again. He goes out into the woods, and the bunny's there, and he's like, hey, king, there is one more oak branch with another fairy inside. Do you want to try again? And the king's like, yeah, I actually do. I really would love to have a fairy bride. And he's like, cool. This time, I'm going to go with you and do you an actual favor. So he leads the king to the oak tree. They make a side detour to go and fetch some water from the stream. So he's like, dump out your wine. Dump it out right now. Why would you show up to the woods without any water, knowing full well that you need water to do this quest? Okay, so they dump out the wine, they fill up the canteen with water, then the rabbit takes the canteen, he's like, I'm gonna be in charge of this. And then they hop or walk their way to the oak tree. He cuts down the last remaining branch. The fairy comes out, doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo, magical, right? And she's like, oh my gosh, I would just love to have some water, please. And then the king's like, oh my god, I would love to give you some water, but... And the rabbit just slaps his hand, and he's like, here, take this little water. And he pours the water into the fairy's mouth himself, because he's like, this fucking guy, okay? So... Then, the fairy sort of comes back to life. She is properly hydrated. She might be part plant, as far as I know. She springs back to life, and she's like, oh my god, I'm so happy that you freed me from that tree. I wonder what happened to my sisters. And the king's like, oh, I don't know. Something crazy must have happened before I got here. This is my first time at this tree. And she's like, oh, well, I hope that they're okay, but I'm just so happy. Thank you for the water. Thank you for saving me from the tree that I was trapped in. How can I repay you? And the king's like, you're so beautiful. Will you be my wife? And she's like, oh yeah, absolutely. I would love to do that. So the king takes her back through the woods. They go all together, her, the king, and the bunny, all go together, and they go back to his, like, kingdom, but they're almost there. They're almost at the castle, right? And they stop by a lake and a well and a tree. And he goes, hey, let's take a break here, and then we'll go to the castle. And she's like, hey, I'm only dressed in fairy clothes, which is code word for I am butt-ass naked. Maybe I should show up to your castle with, like, clothes on. Do you think you could go pick up some clothes? And I could maybe not rock up like Lady Godiva? And he's like, great idea. You stay here, rest underneath the shade of this tree, and I'm gonna go and get you some clothes. That's actually really reasonable. A really reasonable request. I shouldn't bring a bare-ass naked woman through the streets of my kingdom and out to my castle. And she's like, great, I love that we're both on the same page. So the king goes off to go get her some clothes. And then the rabbit's like, hey, I'm just gonna run home real quick, have a bit of supper, and then I'll be back. And she's like, okay, great, sounds good. And as she's sitting there, she's like, whew, it's a little warm, it's a little bit exposed out here. I'm actually just gonna climb up the tree. So she climbs up the tree, and she's just chilling out, waiting for the prince or the king to come back. And while she's waiting, this old woman shows up, and she goes to draw some water from the well. Turns out this old woman is a castle cook. And as she's drawing water from the well, she looks down, and in the reflection, she sees a beautiful maiden. And then she, like, jumps back a little bit, and she's like, have I been transformed? She feels her face. Nope, still old. So then she leans back over, and she's like, there's the beautiful maiden again. So she starts, like, darting around the well, looking around, and she's like, I wonder where this beautiful maiden is, because I can see her in the well, but I can't see her in the well. So then she ends up looking up, because she's not a dum-dum, and she sees that the fairy herself is sitting in the tree, gazing down at her from the tree branch over the well. And so she's like, oh, what are you doing up there, naked girl? And she's like, oh, I'm just waiting for the king to come back. He's going to take me to the castle, and going to take me to wife. And she's like, well, come down here, have some water. It's important to be hydrated. And so the fairy's like, oh my god, I know, it's so important, right? Like, you don't even know how dehydrated I was before I got here. So she climbs down, at which point the woman pretends to offer her water from the well, instead just throws her into the well. And the fairy drowns. And when she drowns, she turns into a fish in the well. And at this point, the old woman like hustles her ass back to the castle. She gets her daughter, who happens to be butt-ass ugly, and she brings her out there, strips her naked, tells her, climb up into this tree, because when the king gets back, he's going to take you to wife. Because she'd always wanted her daughter to marry the king, but the king couldn't be bothered because he thinks everyone's boring. So when the king gets back, he has all these cool clothes. He's like, this is going to be so great. I'm so excited. This is the most adventure and fun that I've had in a while. And then he calls the fairy down from the tree, and when she gets down, he's like, what the fuck is this? And now, this is a point in the story where I have to, like, pause, you guys, because in the story they say that her skin is super dark, and that's why she's ugly. We're not going to say that because that's bullshit, but she does allude to the fact that the reason she looks different is because she was in the tree and the sun basically cooked her until she was ugly. So that's what happens here. We're just going to say the sun aged her, okay? Because the fuck. Fairy tales. Back to the story. So she tells the king, hey, the sun aged me while I was up there. You took too long to bring me the clothes. This is what I look like now. And the king's like already committed to the bit. So he's like, well, okay, fuck it. So he gives her the clothes, takes her back to the palace. They're married. And for a while, everything is fine. Everything's actually pretty okay. The king's happy with his ugly wife. And, he's like, I wish she was prettier, but like, I guess this is the best I got. And things seem to be great. Except that every time the old woman goes to the well, she sees that the fish is still there. And she's like, this is going to be a problem. And someone's going to ask about this fish. Not just because it's like a regular looking fish. No, it's a fairy fish. So of course it's like sparkly and gold and beautiful looking. And she's like, that's not going to work for me. So she goes and she tells her daughter, who is now the queen, to tell the king that she is sick. And the only thing that will cure her is for him to catch the fish from the well and have it made into a dinner for her. So that's what the daughter does. She goes and tells the king, like, oh my god, I'm so sick. I think the only thing that will cure me is that beautiful fish that's in the well. And the king's like, there's a beautiful fish in the well? And she's like, yeah, actually, go get it. So he's like, okay, yeah, totally, yeah, whatever makes you feel better. So he goes down to the well, catches the fish, and brings it back to the kitchen so they can make a meal for her. While he is walking back to the castle, though, a scale from the fish falls to the ground and turns into a beautiful apple tree. So at the castle, the queen, nom 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 nom, eats this fish, delicious. Oh my god, I'm miraculously recovered, right? That whole rigmarole. And then they're like, wow, look at that great giant apple tree that just sort of appeared overnight for no reason out of nowhere. Magical. And the tree is, in fact, extra magical because every morning it blossoms, and by the afternoon it fruits, and by the evening fairies come and they take all the fruits from the tree, and then it does it again. So the fairies have an apple tree. Nobody else has an apple tree is basically what's happened. And, the old woman, the old kitchen maid is like, that's not going to work either. So she tells her daughter, like, hey, that's the fairy you replaced. You need to get rid of that tree. So the daughter goes to the king and she's like, hey, that tree out there is actually really ugly and unsightly, and it just makes me really displeased to see it. Can you get rid of it? I don't think we need it. We have so much stuff already. We already have apples and we can't even eat those apples, so like, why are we keeping this tree around? And the king's like, well, you do have a point. I don't really like having stuff I can't have because I'm the king. So yeah, we'll chop down the tree. So he sends a man to go chop down the tree, which he does. But as he's chopping down the tree, a little splinter of wood falls off, and he's like, this wood is actually really, really nice. Maybe I'll take it home and make like a toy for my daughter. So he takes that little splinter of wood, puts it in his pocket, chops down the tree. They throw it all into like the fireplace or something. They get rid of the wood from the tree. When he goes home, he puts a little piece of wood on his table. He goes about his regular business, and in the morning, the family is like, all right, we all have to get up and go to work, but we, like, partied too hard last night, apparently, and the house is a mess, but we'll have to worry about that when we get back, because we don't have time, we're going to be late. So, the man, the woodcutter, and his wife, and his young daughter all set out to go do their daily jobs. And when they get back, they are astonished, because their entire house, sparkling clean, swept clean, stuff put away, it's beautiful in there. And they're like, what, one of our neighbors broke into our house and cleaned everything. And then, they're just spending all their night thinking about it, thinking about how weird this is, but also how nice it is to have someone come do your housework, which, like, sign me up for the fairy cleaning service, right? But then they're like, okay, we got to figure out who's doing this. So they trashed their house again. And then they're like, maybe one of our neighbors got so offended when they looked through our windows that they were like, I got to clean it. So they end up leaving the young daughter behind outside. So she waits outside. They all pretend to go off to work like normal. And then she sneaks up to the window after everybody has left, and she peeks in. And what she sees is a little fairy come out of the little piece of wood that her father brought home that's on his little workbench. And she starts sweeping, and she just starts cleaning up. And so she's like, I gotta do something about this. She snatches up the piece of wood and puts it in her pocket so that at the evening, when the fairy is done cleaning, she can't return to the wood. It's gone. So when they all come home, quote unquote, because the daughter never left, they greet her openly, and they're like, oh my god, thank you for cleaning our house. We're so happy to have you here. And the fairy's like, oh my god, I'm so embarrassed. Not only am I butt-ass naked cleaning your house, but I'm now here exposed for the world to see. And they're like, nah, pish tosh, we got clothes for you. So they put her in the daughter's clothes. Her and the daughter have like a kiki. They're having a great time. And then the next morning, she's like, hey, come with me to the palace. That's where I work. I'll get you, in there, and you can work with me up there. So she's like, okay, cool. So they go up to the palace, and the maids are like all around the court doing their courtly duties, things like that. I don't know, embroidery, something that they did in the long agos. And while they're there, they're all exchanging stories. And the king happens to like hearing these stories because, as you know, he cannot entertain himself in his own space. So the king's sitting there, he's listening to everyone tell stories, and then he goes, someone tell me a story of your life and the adventures that you've had. I want to hear someone's life story. And at this point, our fairy decides to start telling her life story about how she was trapped in an oak tree with her sisters, and she was saved by a handsome king who was going to take her to wife, but then all of this series of unfortunate events that I've already told you guys about has happened, and now she's here. And when the king looks at her, he's like, double takes. He's like, well, what? Realizes that this is, in fact, his fairy bride that he just did not recognize until this particular moment in time. And she goes, it's me, your fairy. And he's like, oh my god. And then he looks around and he's like, did everyone know that my fairy was right here and not the woman I married? And they're like, well, we just took your word for it. No one's ever seen a fairy before. We don't know what they look like. Maybe they're ugly. And the fairy's like, no, we're not. Actually, we're not. So the king's like, okay, let me rectify this. So he goes to the kitchen and he tells the old woman there, because he now knows the whole story, right? So he goes, hey, what would you do to someone who tried to destroy my wife? And she's like, what I would do is tie them to a horse's tail and drag them through the city streets. And he's like, great, bet. That's what's going to happen. So he ends up having the old woman and her daughter tied up to a horse, dragged through the streets until they die, which is horrific. This man is a menace to women and cannot be stopped. And then he takes the fairy as his wife, and they live happily ever after. And that's the end of the story. And I gotta say, I'm not super happy that the king wins in this story. But I guess at the worst case scenario, he's just an idiot who murdered a couple of women. Accidentally, quote unquote, by not being able to follow directions. And then intentionally murdered a couple of women by not recognizing that women don't just turn ugly when they're exposed to the sun. So he's an idiot. At any rate, I thought this story was really interesting. I've heard another version where it wasn't an oak tree, but actually a pomegranate tree, which sort of gives, like, underworld vibes with the way that they're trapped in there and, like, the whole Hades and Persephone's myth. So I really liked that version, but it would be, like, a real stretch to, like, stretch it into that. So I was like, okay, I'm not gonna do that. This is the traditional version. It is a Hungarian folktale that actually has a couple of different versions and a couple of different iterations with a couple of differences here and there. This is the version I prefer, so this is one I shared. But I thought you guys would like this story. Let me know in the comments below what you think. And if you're like wanting a story to be told on Storycraft in the last couple of episodes, definitely throw it up here now, because now is the time. And that's gonna be it for me, you guys. I appreciate your faces. I will catch you all in the next one. Until then, happy crafting. Bye!